right, back to give another lecture on autonomic nervous system function. Last lecture was largely about the anatomy, the differences and similarities in neurotransmitters, receptors, target tissues, things like that. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit more about what these systems are doing at their target tissues. So keep in mind, one big thing I wanted to reemphasize from the last lecture was that there is significantly greater divergence, neural divergence in the sympathetic division than there is in the parasympathetic. Remember, diverging pathways are ones that split to branch out to more and more targets. And what that means is that the sympathetic, because there's more divergence in the sympathetic division, those responses, when that system is activated, the responses tend to be widespread and fairly significant. The parasympathetic still has some divergence, a lot less, but therefore it tends to be more focal. In other words, directed at specific targets. The other factor that makes the sympathetic division more broad scale is the presence of the adrenal medulla, right? Remember, that was the hormonal neuroendocrine component of the sympathetic that the parasympathetic division lacks, right? The sympathetic division innervates the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla gland, the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland, to release largely epinephrine, but also norepinephrine as hormones. And so that made norepinephrine in the sympathetic division both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Same molecule, different modes of delivery to the target tissue. Okay, so we've got our two divisions. We've got our dramatically different anatomy, right? Remember, thoracolumbar origin for sympathetic and craniosacral for parasympathetic. Despite that, there is significant overlap in the targets. There are a few targets that are innervated only by one or the other system. Blood vessels are a good example. They have a lot of sympathetic innervation and very little or almost no parasympathetic. But most tissues have dual innervation. And what that allows for is what physiologists like to call a push-pull system. What that means is that the actions at these target tissues are being pushed and pulled simultaneously, meaning that one system is tending to be stimulatory to that target, and one is tending to be inhibitory. One's tending to push it in a particular direction, the other's tending to pull it back. I like to use the analogy of driving your car while using the gas pedal and the brake simultaneously. Right? It's sort of like one's trying to make you go faster and one's trying to make you go slower. And so what the body is attempting to do is sort of like control these targets more dynamically with both stimulatory and inhibitory input at the same time. And what that's referred to is, or as, autonomic tone. So autonomic tone is this idea that the output of these two systems tends to be continuous, and really it's just modulating the output of the two relative to each other. In other words, is it more gas than brake at a given moment, or does it flip-flop and the brake starts to win and the gas, you let your foot off the gas a little bit? A really good example of that is heart rate control, right? Cardiac muscle, it's a visceral target, right? So we know that we've got autonomic innervation. And if we do a little quick graph of it, just to give you an example, you'll see this again in AMP2. This is, again, just an example. This isn't content that you need to understand fully right now. But if we look at, very simplistically, what is heart rate relative to ANS output, right? And if we graph it, I'll put two different colors on it here. If we graph it, we would have parasympathetic falling as heart rate goes up, and sympathetic rising and being the stimulus for, right? It's not or cause and effect correct there, right? And so that would be sympathetic. This is parasympathetic. parasympathetic. Right? And so, just as an example, your resting heart rate sits somewhere in about that box. And so what it suggests is that parasympathetic is dominating control of, again, there's a range of normal heart rates, right? We'll just call that normal. Right? But in our normal heart rate zone, the parasympathetic system is dominant, and the sympathetic, right, the gas, if you will, has been released. Not entirely, but has been somewhat released. Now, interestingly, your intrinsic heart rate, if you remove all of the innervation, is much higher than this. And again, let's just put it somewhere about here. Right? If you had no innervation, that's where your heart rate would be, which explains this. Right? If your intrinsic heart rate without any input is 100 beats per minute, yet your resting heart rate is 70 beats per minute, it means that the parasympathetic system is dominant. The parasympathetic tends to be inhibitory at many target tissues. Again, not all, but many target tissues, including heart. Right? And so the parasympathetic is helping us keep heart rate low. It's the brake. The sympathetic being low, the gas being low, is keeping that heart rate less than its intrinsic rate without any input at all. Okay, so that's just a good example of autonomic tone. We can see that in a lot of different target tissues. All right. So let's look at and talk a little bit about the sympathetic division first, right? This is the fight or flight division, right? And so the way to think about this, and the way I want you to be able to answer questions about it, is to think about what the actions of the sympathetic division help support in terms of homeostasis when we are fighting or flighting, right? In other words, exercise, right? And you don't have to think of it as something extreme. Fight or flight sounds like it's very dramatic, right? And that's true. We get a very large sympathetic response if we get scared of something and we have to like run away or fight, right? But if you get up out of a chair and walk across the room to go to the refrigerator, sympathetic output went up and parasympathetic went down, right? Because the sympathetic division is helping to support somatic activity, exercise, right? So let's write this down. Right? That's our F or F system, right? And so it supports somatic activity, which is really exercise, right? And again, exercise not literally like in the gym exercise necessarily, but just increases in you moving around. Does it support your activity in the gym? Of course, but it's not exercise like intentional exercise, right? Just any increase in activity is what I'm referring to here. Okay, so what might be the stimulus derived from an increase in somatic activity, exercise, that would stimulate sympathetic output, right? Because all of these systems are, not all, but many systems are stimulus response systems. And so in this scenario, what we're detecting is a deviation from homeostasis. Well, what deviation? As you begin to exercise, right, you use more oxygen, right? Your aerobic metabolism goes up. You utilize more nutrients to make more ATP, and we do that largely aerobically, and so our oxygen consumption goes up. So think about the blood coming back out of your muscles, right? It's going to have less oxygen than it would when you're at rest. So blood oxygen levels are going to go down. Well, one of the byproducts of that metabolism is carbon dioxide production. That's why we exhale, right? And so as you begin to exercise, again, even just getting up and walking across the room, you're going to produce more carbon dioxide. And so blood carbon dioxide levels are going to go up. Without getting into the details of it, carbon dioxide becomes hydrated in water. We have blood as an aqueous solution, interstitial fluid, aqueous. And so you end up producing an acid. And so pH actually goes down, right? right? And so O2 went down, CO2 went up, pH goes, right, acidity, right, goes up, which means pH goes down. All of those are potential stimuli for receptors found in the central nervous system, and some of them actually peripheral too, but they're big centers for receiving this information from the arterial circuit and other areas. The muscles themselves may send this information into the central nervous system. There are central nervous system receptors themselves, and we get an increase in sympathetic output. All right, so our body knows we're exercising because of those chemical changes to the blood. What do we want to do in response? Well, we want to move more blood, right? We need blood is what's carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide and the acids, the free protons that we're producing. And so to move more blood will allow us to get more oxygen from the air we're breathing, release more CO2, when we exhale, all those things. And so we need to do a couple things. We need to move blood faster, and we need to move more air into the respiratory system. So we get things like bronchodilation, right? Smooth muscle, right? One of the targets, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs. Respiratory tree in the lungs is a hollow organ or hollow structure. And smooth muscle found there in the bronchioles can relax and open up those bronchioles. So when we exercise, the bronchioles relax, open up to allow, reduce the resistance to airflow and increase oxygen uptake as we breathe. What about moving the blood faster, right? So we're potentially getting more oxygen from the air we're breathing. How do we move that oxygen more rapidly? Well, we want our heart rate to go up, right? We might also want the heart to contract harder, right? That's called contractility. And so we're going to get, because of this, the big effect is the heart rate, but because of that, we're going to get an increase in CO. CO is cardiac output. Well, cardiac output is the amount of blood that your heart ejects per unit time. And so if heart rate goes up and it contracts harder, then it's going to push out more blood per unit time. So we're going to be moving more blood to pick up more oxygen and deliver it to those working muscles. That same increased flow to the muscles is going to pick up more of the CO2 that's being produced and deliver it back to the lungs for exhalation, right? And so we get all of these sort of cardiovascular and respiratory responses that are helping to maintain aerobic metabolism at our now active skeletal muscles. Okay, well, we need more oxygen, we produce more CO2. Where's that CO2 coming from? Well, the CO2 actually comes from, that carbon and oxygen comes out of the nutrients that we eat, right? We have to release bond energy to make ATP in our cells. And so we actually need more nutrients as well. So we're going to have an increase in nutrient release, right? And this is largely from the liver and adipose tissue. Right? And so we're going to release nutrients. Our blood nutrient levels will rise in response to largely epinephrine, the hormonal component of the sympathetic division. And our blood nutrient levels will rise. Now our muscles have a fuel. They have more oxygen to burn that fuel. We got more blood flow to remove the wastes as we burn that fuel, and we're trying to maintain homeostasis. Okay, how else, there's one other element here with regard to the cardiovascular system, is that we get an increase in, right, so we're pushing more blood out, but we want to push that blood through blood vessels that have a lower resistance, right? And so if you think about it in terms of flow dynamics, larger pipes, you can get more blood or fluid through larger pipes, right? A fire hose can carry more water than a garden hose. And so we want blood vessels to dilate. We want some blood vessels to dilate. So in addition to cardiac output here, I want to have decrease, I'm going to run out of room here, but a decrease in resistance, right? Well, remember the big pipe has lower resistance. Again, this is AMP2 stuff in terms of the hemodynamics, but I just want you to understand why we're having a vasodilation, a relaxation of certain skeletal muscle, right, blood vessels, right? Because that's where we want more blood flow. That's where we need more oxygen. That's where we need more nutrients. So we want those blood vessels to open up, have a lower resistance and greater flow. Okay? How about the GI tract? Right? You ever hear your grandmother say or your grandfather say, right? That's a sort of an old adage, right? Don't go swimming right after you eat a meal, right? You'll get cramps and drown, right? Well, maybe you haven't heard that one, but I have. And what they're trying to infer is this sort of like, well, you can't maximize blood flow to two really big organ systems simultaneously. And so we want to send our blood flow to, as we're exercising, our blood flow to our muscles, and we're going to reduce blood flow to the GI tract, right? And so we're actually going to constrict there. Well, how do you dilate at one location and constrict at another through the same system, right? Through sympathetic output. Receptor subtypes, right? The alpha receptors mediate constriction, while the beta receptors mediate vasodilation. And so skeletal muscle, because of the higher numbers of beta receptors, we get vasodilation. And the GI tract, because of higher numbers of alpha receptors, we're going to get constriction. And so what our body's doing is sort of shunting this increased cardiac output, right, to the areas that need it most. Right? So we get vascular changes, cardiac changes, respiratory changes, nutrient release effects, all of which are helping to sustain our increase in somatic activity. Now, do we need GI? This is again back to the whole like don't go swimming after you eat lunch thing, right? Do you need to want to be enhancing GI activity and digestion while you're trying to exercise? No, it's not going to be optimal because again, you don't have, you're not maximizing blood flow there, which means you can't maximize the metabolism there. And so we're going to have the sympathetic system also decrease GI function, decreases motility of the GI tract, motility being the contractions that move food along the tract. It's going to decrease secretions there that aid digestion, like enzymes and buffers and things like that. And so we're just kind of turn down the activity of the GI tract during exercise because of an increase in sympathetic output. Okay, lastly, we would want to inhibit insulin. Insulin is a nutrient storing, come back to this last bit here. Insulin is a nutrient storing hormone, tends to promote nutrient storage inside cells. And we're trying to get that the nutrients to be released from some of these target tissues, right? And so it's actually going to be inhibitory to insulin. Okay. I think we've got our sympathetic system knocked out. Let's jump over to the parasympathetic system. A little less detail on this parasympathetic because it has, again, well, one thing I can say very readily right off the bat is that because we, that tone that we talked about before, the parasympathetic is inhibitory to pretty much everything I said here, right? The one place it's not is over here at blood vessels. That tends to be largely sympathetic innervation, very little parasympathetic. So we can't call it tone there, well, at least not autonomic tone, because we don't have two systems, right? We only have the brake or the gas, if you will, right? We don't have both of them in place. Okay. Switch over. One other term I wanted to throw onto the sympathetic system, and again, I mentioned it, but I didn't put the term on it, is the system that causes the breakdown and release of stored nutrients would be catabolic, right? Metabolism falls into two big categories, which is sort of breaking things down and releasing molecules and using them for energy. And then the other version is that's catabolism. And the other version, let me write that out for you. right? So catabolism is breaking, right? Breaking and releasing. And again, sometimes we can release to uptake those nutrients elsewhere and then break them further to produce ATP, right? Swapping bond energy from in nutrients to bond energy in ATP. That's catabolism. Anabolism is the building of larger molecules using smaller molecules, right? Taking monomers and making polymers. That's anabolism. And that tends to be what's promoted by the parasympathetic division. So sympathetic favors catabolism, breaking nutrients down. We're utilizing those nutrients for energy. Anabolism is sort of when we're not exercising and you're sort of digesting and absorbing nutrients, right? And we want to build and repair when parasympathetic system is dominant. And that's going to be favoring anabolic pathways. So, parasympathetic division is our rest and digest, right? This is the system that is active, more active when we are not exercising, and it tends to promote digestion. So there we have it. Now, right, so you don't want to think of it as sympathetic as stimulatory and parasympathetic as inhibitory. Yes, that's true at many of the targets that I just mentioned. It's not true at the GI tract. At the GI tract, the parasympathetic is stimulatory and the sympathetic is inhibitory. Their roles have flip-flopped, right? And so increases GI motility would be one, right? This is the contractions of the smooth muscle of the GI tract helping to mix and propel the food along the GI tract. It's going to increase GI secretions, right? Again, enzymes, buffers, acids, different locations, right? To aid the breakdown of those nutrients so they can be absorbed and fuel the anabolic pathways. To fuel the anabolic pathways, we would want to increase insulin sensitivity, right? Or insulin secretion at least. Right? Because insulin is an anabolic hormone. It tends to promote the uptake of nutrients and the building of those nutrients into storage polymers. And so these GI secretions are going to aid the breakdown of nutrients. It's going to increase our blood nutrient levels. Again, our blood nutrient levels go up. We want them to be stored, so we're going to increase insulin to help store those nutrients. And now we've got a fully, sort of aiding digestion and promote the uptake and storage of those molecules that we're digesting. Keep in mind, we're also inhibitory, so decrease in heart rate, in cardiac output, right? This is opposing the sympathetic response. We could say decreased bronchodilation, or you could say bronchoconstriction occurs as well, because that's sort of the opposite of bronchodilation. Right? Again, do you need enormous amounts of oxygen while you're laying on a couch, eating and resting? No. I mean, the metabolism of your GI tract goes up, but not remotely as dramatically as the metabolism of skeletal muscle goes up when you're exercising. And so metabolic rate really doesn't rise dramatically in response to this sort of like laying on a couch and digesting and storing those nutrients. All right, and there we have it. There's a parasympathetic division aiding digestion and anabolism. Remember that tends to oppose your sympathetic division, which promotes catabolism and helps to maintain homeostasis during exercise by increasing cardiac output, reducing resistance to blood flow at skeletal muscle. Remember, it increases resistance to GI tract because we've decreased the function there. And I think that's about it. Okay.